If you think silence in a room is empty, you've never stood in front of Dylan Whitmore when he stops speaking. The kind of silence that follows him is not absence, it is control. It is every conversation forgetting itself mid-sentence. It is air turning heavier without permission. I learned that on a Thursday evening at Whitmore Empire, when I stayed late to finish reports nobody else wanted to touch. I, Emily Carter, was just supposed to be a secretary, temporary, replaceable, invisible. That was the rule I gave myself the first day I walked into the building. But rules in places like this don't survive long. The city outside the glass walls of the executive floor was already drowning in neon reflections, taxis moving like distant thoughts, and I remember adjusting my skirt without thinking, pulling it slightly straighter because I had been sitting too long, because I had forgotten to leave on time again. I didn't know he had entered the floor until I felt it, that shift in temperature that didn't belong to weather or building systems. It belonged to a person. Dylan Whitmore didn't announce himself. He never needed to. He appeared at the edge of the office corridor like the space had been waiting for him all along. Dark suit, calm posture, eyes that didn't scan a room but measured it. I kept my head down, focusing on my screen, pretending spreadsheets could protect me from awareness. But awareness is a strange thing in his presence. It doesn't ask permission. It arrives. I heard his voice before I saw him fully, low, controlled, directed at someone behind me, then cutting off mid-sentence as if the rest of the world had lost relevance. Who told you to dress this daring? The words were not loud. They didn't need volume to land. They landed anyway, right in the center of the room, and suddenly I realized he was looking at me. Not the whole room. Me. I froze, fingers still hovering above my keyboard, unsure if I was allowed to move or if movement itself had become something I had to justify. My skirt suddenly felt like a detail I had never considered important until that exact second. Sir, it's just office attire. I managed, my voice smaller than I intended, as if volume itself had rules I had broken without knowing. He stepped closer, slow enough that it didn't feel like approach, it felt like decision. His presence didn't rush. It didn't need to. It reorganized everything around it. The air between us tightened in ways I couldn't explain, like the room had quietly agreed to listen. Office attire, he repeated, not questioning the words, but weighing them, as if language itself had become negotiable. Somewhere behind him, the city continued moving, but here, in this glass tower above Manhattan streets, time seemed to pause out of respect or fear, I couldn't tell which. I forced myself to stand still, even though every instinct told me to step back, to create distance, to reclaim something normal. But normal didn't exist in his proximity. You stayed late, he said finally, his gaze shifting from my face to the desk covered in unfinished work. It wasn't a question. It was observation. I had work to complete. I replied carefully, because honesty felt safer than guessing what answer he expected. A long pause followed, not uncomfortable for him, only for me. Then he said quietly, "You always do." And somehow that sentence felt heavier than the first one. Not accusation, not praise. Something in between that made me unsure whether I had been seen or assessed. I didn't realize I had been holding my breath until he turned slightly, giving the room permission to breathe again, though I wasn't sure I had been granted the same permission yet. After he said those words, the room did not return to normal. It simply learned how to pretend it had. I sat back down at my desk because I did not know what else to do with my body, my hands returning to the keyboard even though the numbers on the screen no longer made sense in the same way. Dylan Whitmore had already walked away, but his presence did not. It lingered in the corners of the office like a decision that had not been fully signed yet. I told myself to focus. That was what people like me did. Focus, finish work, go home, repeat. But every few seconds, I felt it again, that awareness, that invisible weight of being noticed by someone who never looked without meaning. Something. I adjusted my posture without thinking, subtly pulling my jacket into place, suddenly too aware of every detail I had ignored earlier in the day. Around me, the office had thinned out. Only a few employees remained on the executive floor, their screens glowing in the dim light like small, isolated worlds. Then I heard footsteps again, measured, unhurried, stopping directly behind my chair. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. "You are still here," Dylan said, not as surprise, but as confirmation of a pattern he had already observed. I turned slightly, just enough to meet his gaze without fully facing him. "I have reports to finalize, sir," I replied, careful, professional, as if titles could create distance strong enough to matter. His eyes dropped briefly to my desk, where documents were stacked neatly beside a pen I had not touched in several minutes. "You stay longer than required," he said. It was not criticism. It was recognition. I hesitated before answering, because something about the way he spoke made even simple truths feel exposed. "I prefer to finish what I start," I said finally. A pause followed. Not uncomfortable for him. Only for me. He shifted slightly, his attention moving again to me. Not the desk, not the room, only me. "And yet," he said quietly, "you do not seem like someone who enjoys staying unseen." The words landed with precision, not loud, but exact, like he had placed them deliberately where they would be impossible to ignore. My throat tightened slightly. I forced a small breath before responding. "I am not trying to be seen," I said. "I am just doing my job." For the first time, something subtle changed in his expression, not emotion exactly, but calculation adjusting itself. He stepped closer to the edge of my desk, close enough that I could feel the space between authority and personal distance collapse into something uncertain. "That is what everyone says," he replied, "until they are seen." I looked away first, because holding his gaze felt like participating in something I did not fully understand. Outside the glass walls, the city had shifted into deeper night, headlights tracing slow lines across the streets below like distant signals from another life. I reached for a folder to occupy my hands, but he spoke again before I could open it. "Tell me something, Emily Carter," he said, and hearing my name in his voice made it feel different, as if it belonged to a context I had not agreed to. I looked up again reluctantly. "Do you always dress like this when you stay late, or only when you think no one important will notice?" The question was not sharp. It was controlled, but it carried weight, the kind that made silence feel like an answer if you waited too long. I swallowed, forcing steadiness into my voice. "I dress for work," I said, "not for attention." He studied me for a long moment, and in that silence I became painfully aware of every detail I had never thought mattered before. The way I sat, the way I held my hands, the way I tried not to take up space while still existing in it. Then he said softly, "That is where you are mistaken." And without another word, he turned slightly as if preparing to leave, but not before leaving something behind that I could not yet name, something that made the rest of the night feel like it was no longer entirely mine. The moment he walked away did not feel like an ending. It felt like something had been placed into the room and left there intentionally, like a question that would not disappear even if no one spoke it again. I stayed at my desk longer than necessary, pretending to review financial summaries, but my attention kept drifting back to the space he had occupied just minutes before. The air felt unchanged and yet different, as if the building itself remembered his presence more clearly than I did. I told myself to stop thinking about it, but that was easier said than done when silence started sounding like his voice. Around midnight, the executive floor was almost empty. The cleaning staff had not yet arrived, and the city outside had dimmed into a soft blur of distant lights. I finally closed my laptop, exhaling slowly as if that might reset something inside me. That was when I noticed the envelope. It was placed neatly on the corner of my desk, not thrown, not hidden, but positioned with deliberate precision, as if it had always belonged there. My name was written on it in clean, controlled handwriting. Emily Carter. No title, no department, just my name. I hesitated before touching it, the way people hesitate before opening something they instinctively know will change their night. When I finally picked it up, it felt heavier than paper should. I turned it over once, then twice, before opening it carefully. Inside was not money, not a contract, not anything obvious. It was a simple card with a single printed line and a second line written by hand. The printed line read, "Whitmore Empire Executive Office Access." The handwritten line beneath it said, "You will need this tomorrow morning." I sat back in my chair, staring at it longer than I should have. Tomorrow morning. As if my schedule had already been adjusted without my consent. As if my presence somewhere was no longer optional. My phone buzzed suddenly, making me flinch more than I wanted to admit. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something in me made me answer. There was a pause on the other end. Then his voice, calm and controlled as if it belonged in a different category of silence entirely. "You are still in the building. Dylan Whitmore said, not asking, confirming. I looked around instinctively, even though I knew he could not see me. Yes, I replied carefully. Another pause, shorter this time. Do not leave yet, he said. There was no urgency in his tone. That was what made it feel like instruction rather than request. I tightened my grip on the phone. May I ask why? I said, immediately regretting the question because it sounded braver than I felt. He did not answer immediately. Instead, I heard faint background noise on his end, something like movement, a door closing softly, then stillness. When he finally spoke again, his voice lowered slightly. Because you misunderstand your position here, he said. And I prefer misunderstandings to be corrected early. My fingers went still around the phone. I am not sure I understand, I admitted. Another pause. Then, quieter, almost like a conclusion rather than a continuation, he said, you will. The call ended before I could respond. I sat there for a moment, the phone still warm in my hand, the card on my desk feeling suddenly less like an object and more like a threshold. Outside the glass walls, the city continued its indifferent rhythm, taxis moving through intersections, lights shifting, people going home to lives that did not involve unexpected instructions from men like Dylan Whitmore. But my night no longer felt like it belonged to that same category of normal. I looked at the access card again, then at the empty office around me, then at the elevator doors at the far end of the floor. And for reasons I could not fully explain, I did not leave. The elevator doors opened before I decided I was ready to walk through them. That was the first thing I noticed, as if the building itself had already acknowledged my decision before I fully made it. I stepped inside slowly, the access card still in my hand, feeling like a small object that suddenly carried more weight than it should. The elevator interior was quiet, polished, almost too clean, reflecting my face in faint layers of glass and steel. I pressed the button for the top executive level without hesitation, even though part of me wanted to press cancel just to prove I still had control over my own choices. The doors closed with a soft sound that felt final in a way I did not fully understand yet. The ascent was smooth, too smooth, like the building was designed to make upward movement feel inevitable. Each floor passed with a soft chime, but I stopped paying attention after the third. My reflection in the mirrored wall looked the same as it had earlier that evening, except now there was something subtle in my expression I could not name. Not fear exactly, not curiosity either, something in between. When the elevator stopped, the doors opened without delay. The executive floor was darker than the rest of the building, lit only by soft recessed lighting that made everything feel quieter than it should have been. I stepped out slowly, my heels echoing lightly against the polished floor, each sound feeling too noticeable in the silence. At the far end of the hallway, I saw him. Dylan Whitmore was standing near a large glass window that overlooked the city. He was not looking at me at first. He was looking outward, as if the city below was part of a conversation he was still having in his mind. Then, without turning fully, he spoke. You came. It was not surprise. It was confirmation. I tightened my grip on the access card slightly. I was not sure I had a choice, I said honestly. That made him turn. Slowly. Not rushed. Never rushed. His eyes met mine and held there, steady, unreadable, as if he was evaluating something that had already been in motion long before I arrived. You always have a choice, he said. A pause followed, measured and controlled. Then he added, but most people only realize it after they have already made it. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I stepped forward just enough to feel less like a visitor and more like someone who had crossed a boundary without knowing exactly where it was drawn. The city lights behind him cast faint reflections across the glass, surrounding him in shapes that made him look even more distant and closer at the same time. Why am I here? I asked finally. My voice was steady, but it felt like it belonged to someone slightly braver than me. He did not answer right away. Instead, he walked toward a nearby desk, picked up a thin folder, and placed it down between us. Not aggressively, not casually, deliberately. Because you have been working in this company for 6 months, he said, and in that time you have done something most people here do not manage in 6 years. I glanced at the folder but did not open it yet. And what is that? I asked. He studied me for a moment longer than necessary. You notice things, he said simply. Details others ignore. Patterns they dismiss. People they underestimate. I frowned slightly. That sounds like something anyone could do if they paid attention. For the first time, Something faint shifted in his expression. Not amusement. Not approval. Something closer to recognition. No, he said quietly. Most people avoid paying attention because it makes them accountable for what they see. The words lingered in the space between us. I finally opened the folder. Inside were documents, reports, schedules, and notes, all marked, with my name in small annotations in the margins. I had not seen them before. I looked up. I did not authorize any of this, I said. You did not need to, he replied calmly. You have already been doing it. My heartbeat felt slightly louder after that. I closed the folder slowly, placing my hands flat on the edge of the desk to steady myself. I am a secretary, I said. Not whatever this is supposed to mean. Dylan Whitmore stepped closer, stopping at a distance that was close enough to feel intentional, but far enough to remain controlled. Titles are descriptions, he said. Not limitations. A silence followed. Not heavy, not uncomfortable, just unfinished. I looked at him, trying to understand where this conversation was leading, but finding only clarity in one thing. Nothing about this building, this night, or this man was accidental. And for the first time since I had walked into Whitmore Empire, I was no longer sure whether I had been working there or being observed by it. There are moments in life when silence stops feeling like emptiness and starts feeling like expectation. I felt that as I stood in front of the desk, the folder still closed in my hands, the weight of Dylan Whitmore's presence steady across from me. He did not move closer, yet nothing about the distance between us felt accidental anymore. It was as if the space itself had been measured and agreed upon long before I arrived. I finally set the folder down, carefully, as though sudden movement might change something irreversible. I do not understand what you want from me, I said, and I meant it more than anything I had said all night. Dylan's gaze did not shift. It remained steady, calm, and unsettling in the way certainty can feel when it belongs to someone else. I do not want anything from you, he said. The answer should have been relieving. Instead, it made the room feel tighter. I exhaled slowly, trying to find logic in something that refused to behave logically. Then why am I here? I asked again, quieter this time. He turned slightly toward the window, looking out at the city lights below. For a moment, he did not speak, and I wondered if the answer was something he had not decided to give yet. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, not softer, just more precise. Because you noticed something in this company that others did not, he said. And because you continued working as if that meant nothing. I frowned slightly, confused. I am still not sure that is unusual, I replied. He looked back at me then, fully. That is exactly why it is, he said. The words settled between us without urgency. I crossed my arms lightly, partly for comfort, partly to feel like I had some control over my own posture. I am just doing my job, I said again, though this time it sounded less certain. Dylan stepped back toward the desk, placing one hand near the folder without opening it. Your job title is secretary, he said, but your actions have not matched that limitation since the day you arrived. I hesitated. Are you saying I did something wrong? A faint pause followed, and for the first time, something subtle passed through his expression that I could not immediately classify. Not approval, not correction, something closer to recognition again, but deeper. I am saying you did something rare, he said. I looked down at the folder again, my name still visible on the top page. I am not special, I said quietly, almost reflexively, because that had always been easier than the alternative. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he walked toward the window again, placing distance between himself and the desk, as if giving space to the thought itself. Most people in this building, he said finally, do not see beyond what is directly in front of them. They follow instructions. They follow structure. They follow comfort. He turned slightly back toward me. You did none of those things. I felt a shift inside me that I could not immediately explain. Not fear. Not pride. Something unsettled, like a door I had never noticed being unlocked. What happens now? I asked, because it felt like the only question that mattered. Dylan Whitmore studied me for a long moment. Then he said, now you stop being invisible. The sentence was simple, but it landed with a weight I was not prepared for. I looked at him, searching for irony, for manipulation, for anything that would make it less real. But there was none. Only certainty. Outside the glass, the city continued as if nothing had changed. But inside that office, something already had. And for the first time since I had entered Whitmore Empire, I was no longer sure I had been hired by a company, or chosen by a system, or quietly placed into something much larger than I had ever been told. The office felt different the next morning, even before I fully understood why. It was not the furniture, not the lighting, not the routine hum of employees arriving early. It was something subtler, like the building itself had adjusted its expectations overnight. I arrived at Whitmore Empire at exactly 8:30, the access card still in my purse like a question I had not answered properly. The receptionist greeted me with the same polite professionalism as always, but her eyes lingered a fraction longer than usual, as if she had been told to notice me without knowing why. I took the elevator alone, watching the numbers rise in silence, my reflection steady but unfamiliar in the polished metal doors. When I reached my floor, I noticed immediately that my desk had changed. It was not dramatic, not relocated or redesigned, but reorganized in a way that made it clear someone had been there before me. Files were stacked neatly in a different order, a second monitor had been added, and a small printed schedule sat aligned perfectly beside my keyboard with my name at the top. Emily Carter. Assigned Division, Executive Operations Support. I stared at it longer than I intended. I had not applied for anything. I had not requested a change. And yet, everything suggested a decision had already been made. I had just sat down when I heard footsteps behind me. I did not need to turn to recognize them anymore. Dylan Whitmore stopped beside my desk, not sitting, not leaning, simply observing the space as if confirming it met an internal standard only he understood. "You are early," he said. It was not a comment. It was an observation of pattern. "I always arrive at this time," I replied carefully. He nodded slightly, as if confirming data. Then his eyes shifted briefly to the updated setup on my desk. "They adjusted your placement," he said. I frowned. I did not request a new role. A pause followed, brief but deliberate. "No," he said. "You did not." I stood slowly, unsure whether standing would help me feel more in control or simply make me more visible. "Then why has it changed?" I asked. Dylan Whitmore looked at me directly. "Because what you were doing before was not aligned with what this company requires from you now," he said. The sentence should have sounded corporate, procedural, harmless. Instead, it felt personal in a way I could not fully explain. I looked at the schedule again, reading my name as if it belonged to someone else. "I am not qualified for executive operations," I said honestly. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he walked a few steps toward the glass wall, looking out at the city below as if distance helped clarify intent. "Qualification is not the issue," he said finally. "Attention is." I turned slightly toward him. "Attention to what?" He paused, just long enough for the silence to feel intentional. "To what matters beneath the surface," he said. I exhaled slowly, trying to ground myself in something logical. "I still do not understand what you think I am seeing," I admitted. Dylan Whitmore turned back toward me, his expression unchanged but more focused than before. "You will," he said again, the same certainty from the night before, returning without hesitation. Then he added something softer, though not less controlled. "And when you do, you will not be able to return to not seeing it." I sat back down slowly, my hands resting on the desk, the new monitor glowing softly in front of me as if waiting for input I had not yet been taught to give. Around me, the office began its normal morning rhythm, phones ringing, voices rising, footsteps moving across polished floors. But inside my immediate space, nothing felt ordinary anymore. I looked at Dylan Whitmore one more time before he left my desk. He was already turning away, already moving back into the structure of his world. But something about the way he had spoken stayed behind, like an instruction that had not yet finished unfolding. And, for the first time, I wondered not what I had been hired to do, but what I had already begun to notice without realizing it. The rest of the day did not feel like a continuation of normal work. It felt like I had stepped into a version of my job where nothing was explicitly explained, yet everything was already decided. My new monitor stayed on throughout the morning, displaying dashboards and internal reports that I had never seen before, each one labeled with departments I had only heard mentioned in passing conversations. I did my best to focus on my assigned tasks, but it was impossible to ignore the fact that my access had quietly expanded overnight without any formal explanation. Around 11 in the morning, I noticed a notification appear on my screen, a meeting invitation with no subject line and only a single participant listed, Dylan Whitmore. The location was not a conference room. It was the executive floor office. I stared at it for several seconds before accepting, partly because declining felt like an answer I was not prepared to give. When I arrived, he was already there, standing near the same glass window as before, looking down at the city as if it were a system he had already mapped completely. He did not turn immediately when I entered. Instead, he spoke as if he had been continuing a thought from earlier. "You are adapting faster than expected," he said. I stopped a few feet away from him. "I am still trying to understand what I am adapting to," I replied. He finally turned, his expression unchanged but attentive. "That is why you are here," he said. I crossed my arms lightly, grounding myself in something physical. "I am not sure I agreed to anything beyond my original position," I said carefully. Dylan Whitmore walked toward the desk slowly, his movements controlled, deliberate, as if each step had been chosen rather than taken. "Your original position was temporary," he said. "Everything after that has been observation." I frowned slightly. Observation of what exactly? A brief silence followed, not empty, but measured. "Of whether you see patterns," he said, "or simply accept them." I looked down at the folder still sitting on the desk from the night before. It had not moved. Nothing about it had changed, and yet it felt different now, as if its contents were no longer just information, but part of a larger structure I had not yet been shown. "And if I do see them?" I asked. Dylan Whitmore studied me for a moment that felt longer than it should have. "Then you stop being someone who only follows instructions," he said. I let that settle before responding. "And what do I become?" I asked quietly. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked past me toward the office floor outside the glass walls, where employees moved through their routines unaware of the conversation happening above them. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, almost calm. "Someone who understands why the instructions exist," he said. The words created a silence that felt heavier than anything he had said before. I shifted slightly, trying to find balance in a conversation that kept moving just beyond the edge of certainty. "That sounds like responsibility," I said. "It is," he replied without hesitation. I looked at him directly now, no longer trying to soften my posture or hide uncertainty. "Why me?" I asked. For the first time, something in his expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to suggest the question had reached a place he had not fully closed off. "Because most people," he said slowly, "look at what they are told to look at." A pause. "You looked at what was missing." The word stayed with me longer than I expected. I glanced down at my hands, then back at the city beyond the glass, where nothing appeared different, yet everything suddenly felt slightly misaligned, as if I had been shown a version of reality that required adjustment. Dylan Whitmore stepped back toward the window, returning to his original position as if the conversation had reached its intended point. "You do not need to decide anything today," he said. "Just continue observing." I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, aware that nothing about this encounter had provided clarity in the way I had hoped. Instead, it had expanded the uncertainty into something larger, something structured, something intentional. And as I left the office that day, I realized the most unsettling part was not what he had told me, but the fact that I could no longer tell where my job ended and his expectations began. The following days did not bring answers, only refinement. It was as if the world inside Whitmore Empire had shifted into a quieter version of itself, one where nothing was openly different, but everything was subtly aligned around a pattern I had not yet fully recognized. My access continued to expand without explanation. Meetings appeared on my calendar before I was informed of them. Reports arrived in folders already pre-sorted by relevance to projects I had never been formally assigned. And every time I questioned it, the response was the same absence of contradiction, as if the system itself assumed I would eventually accept what was already happening. Dylan Whitmore remained consistent in the same way weather remains consistent in winter. He did not overwhelm the space, he defined it. I would see him once a day, sometimes briefly in passing, sometimes in meetings where he spoke more through silence than instruction. He never explained more than necessary, and yet nothing he said ever felt incomplete. It was on the fifth morning that I noticed something I could not ignore. A report labeled Internal Behavioral Tracking had been attached to my dashboard. My name was on it. Emily Carter. Below it were observations. Not judgments. Not instructions. Observations of my response times, my decision patterns, my reaction intervals during meetings, even my pauses before answering certain questions. I stared at the screen longer than I intended, a strange pressure forming in my chest that I could not immediately categorize. I had never agreed to being analyzed in this way, and yet the existence of the document suggested consent was not the relevant variable. I closed the file, then reopened it again, as if repetition might reveal intent. That was when I heard a knock at my office door. Dylan Whitmore entered without waiting for permission, as he always did, but this time he was not alone. He carried nothing, but his presence felt more deliberate than usual. "You have seen the report," he said, not as question but confirmation. I did not try to hide it. "Yes," I replied. He nodded once, then stepped further into the room, stopping near the center instead of the window. "And your conclusion," he asked, "is what?" I hesitated, choosing words carefully. "It feels like I am being measured without context," I said. He studied me for a moment, then responded calmly. "Context is something people request when they want to reduce responsibility for what they already understand," he said. I frowned slightly. "I do not understand what I am supposed to understand," I replied. A pause followed, longer than the ones before. "Not uncomfortable, but deliberate." "That is not accurate," he said quietly. "You are already understanding. You are simply not accustomed to trusting it." I looked at him, trying to find something in his expression that would anchor the conversation back into something familiar, something procedural, something safe. There was none. "Why am I being observed?" I asked. Dylan Whitmore walked to the side of the room, picking up a thin document from a secondary desk I had not noticed before. He did not open it. He simply held it as if its weight alone was enough. "Because observation removes assumption," he said. "And assumption is where most failures begin." I exhaled slowly. "And what failure are you trying to prevent?" I asked. He turned back toward me, and for the first time since I had met him, his answer was not immediate. "The failure of missing what is already happening in front of everyone," he said finally. The words settled into the space between us without resolution. I looked down at my desk, at the multiple systems open on my screen, at the way my name appeared in places it had never appeared before. I realized then that nothing I had experienced in this building was random. Not my assignments, not my access, not even my conversations. Everything had been part of a structure I was still trying to name. When I looked back up, Dylan Whitmore was already watching me, as if waiting not for a response, but for recognition. And for the first time, I understood that recognition was no longer optional. The moment I stopped trying to interpret everything was the moment everything began to feel clearer. It did not happen suddenly, but gradually, like a system resolving itself once resistance is removed. I noticed it first in how I read reports. What once felt like scattered corporate information now formed patterns I could recognize without being told what to look for. Departments that appeared unrelated began to align in ways that suggested coordination beneath the surface. Financial movements, scheduling changes, internal approvals, all of it formed a structure that was no longer invisible to me. And I realized something unsettling. I was not being taught to perform tasks. I was being trained to recognize structure. Dylan Whitmore did not speak to me that day. Not directly. Instead, I received access updates, system permissions, and a new level of clearance labeled simply as Observer Tier 2. There was no explanation attached. There never was. Yet I no longer felt the need to ask for one. By the afternoon, I found myself reviewing a sequence of internal communications that connected multiple executive decisions across divisions I had never physically entered. What should have felt overwhelming instead felt increasingly familiar, like learning a language I had unknowingly been exposed to for years. That was when the message arrived. Not on my personal email, not on my work channel. It appeared directly in the internal system window that had never been used for direct communication before. One line. "Come to the executive floor when you understand what you are looking at." No signature, no timestamp, but I did not need either. I closed my workstation, stood slowly, and for the first time since I began working at Whitmore Empire, I did not feel uncertain about whether I was supposed to go somewhere. I already knew I would. The elevator ride felt different this time. Not because anything had changed physically, but because I was no longer searching for permission in every number that passed. When the doors opened, Dylan Whitmore was already there waiting. Not at the window, not at the desk, just standing in the center of the space as if he had already accounted for the exact moment I would arrive. "You see it now," he said as soon as I stepped out. It was not a question. I approached slowly, stopping at a respectful distance. I see that everything is connected, I said carefully, but I do not yet understand the purpose. He studied me for a moment, then turned slightly toward the glass wall overlooking the city. Purpose comes after recognition, he said. Most people never reach that stage because they refuse to accept what they are already looking at. I glanced at the room around us, at the quiet precision of its design, at the absence of anything unnecessary. And what am I supposed to do with recognition? I asked. Dylan Whitmore turned back to me. You stop being someone who reacts, he said, and start being someone who anticipates. The words did not feel like instruction anymore. They felt like transition. I exhaled slowly, realizing something I had not allowed myself to admit until that moment. Nothing I had experienced since the first night in this building had been random, or accidental, or even personal in the way I originally believed. It had been structural, intentional, measured. So this is not about my job, I said quietly. He shook his head once. No, he replied. It never was. A long silence followed. Not empty, but complete. I looked at him, then at the city beyond the glass, and for the first time I did not feel like I was standing inside a company. I felt like I was standing inside a system that had already decided I belonged to it before I ever understood why.